but we are seeing increasing deforestation in the Amazon, increasing loss of biodiversity in ways that are frankly truly scary. And so it's critical for the Amazon to be transitioning away from these deforestation dependent models toward a socio-bioeconomy.
Hey everyone, we are excited to launch a new podcast series in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, The Road to COP30. Throughout September, we'll be speaking with leaders from the Nature Conservancy across Latin America to explore their work ahead of COP30, taking place this November in Pará State, Brazil. On episode 4, we sit down with two leaders from the Nature Conservancy, Lisa Ferguson, Director of Regenerative Economies and Community Finance, and Juliana Simões, Deputy Manager of the Indigenous Peoples and Traditional Communities Strategy. Together, they discuss how the sociobioeconomy offers a just and sustainable development pathway for the Amazon. They highlight how diverse value chains from açaí to Brazil nuts demonstrate that protecting biodiversity can power thriving local economies. The conversation also spotlights Pará's pioneering Bioeconomy Plan, which is shaping a global model for inclusive, nature-based development. Join us for an inspiring look at how regenerative economies are redefining the future of people and the planet. In this specific episode, we are focused on the socio-bioeconomy, looking primarily in Pará State in Brazil, which is tied directly to COP30 because that's where it is this year. Lisa, I'll first ask you, could you speak on your background and your role with the Nature Conservancy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having us, Preston. It's a pleasure to be here. So I have been with the Nature Conservancy for around 8 years now. I come from the private sector, so I previously worked in investment finance and corporate strategy, but moved over to the Nature Conservancy to really focus on how to use those market and finance tools for environmental and social impact. So I have worked with our impact investment team, NatureVest, and I've also worked with our Indigenous and local community-led conservation team to really build out what does regenerative economies or socio-bioeconomies strategy look like? How does a conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy engage in that work to really drive mutual benefits and conservation outcomes? And like I said, how do we really kind of create a new economic path forward by using some of those markets and finance tools, but using them for social and environmental impact?
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to get into some of these topics with you on regenerative economies. And then, Juliana, if you want to give a brief on your role as well as your background with the Nature Conservancy.
Well, my name is Juliana Simões. I've been at TNC for 6 years, and I work directly with Indigenous and traditional communities, aiming to improve the economies that help keep the forest standing. I come from 20 years of work in the federal government, also in the field of conservation, working with Indigenous peoples and traditional communities, specifically working on the economies of Indigenous peoples and traditional communities, on how to strengthen these economies as a viable income alternative for the communities while maintaining their way of life, their culture, but also keeping the forest standing and preserving all the ecosystem services provided by that forest.
Well, thank you, Juliana, for joining us and being here and speaking on all the work that you do as well. The first thing I want to get into, and I'll kind of give an overview of this episode, we're going to look at the global picture, and then we'll dive directly into the Amazon and then further into Pará State, into Brazil. But the first thing I want to start with is with you, Lisa, and looking at the global context and looking at, the current, economic models that we're facing and then why there needs to be a change. I mean, right now we're seeing climate change, biodiversity loss, and inequality, and they're all deeply interconnected. And I would say current economic systems are really, often driving deforestation and are excluding those who steward the land. So, I would ask you first, why do we need a new economic model from a global lens?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on that our current dominant economic models are really major drivers of loss of carbon stores, of deforestation, of loss of biodiversity, of infringements on human rights, as well as of extraction of value away from local producers and local communities toward large multinational corporations. And so, we're all seeing the harm of that. We're all seeing the world get warmer. We're all seeing some of our favorite places, no longer exist or no longer be the same places that we're used to visiting when we were kids, maybe, or when our parents were kids. And so we know that we need a new path forward if we are going to continue to be able to survive on this planet and really live in harmony with nature and live in right relationship with nature and people. And what we see emerging as an economic model is actually really rooted in the past. It's the sociobioeconomy, or sometimes called regenerative economies, nature-based economies, indigenous economies. And these are economies that are really rooted in indigenous and traditional ways of being and economic systems that really have lived in harmony with people and nature for generations. And we're now seeing that re-emerging as a solution to our global economic crises and the interrelated social and environmental crises. And so what we're looking at is, how do we have economies that really are not deforestation dependent, that actually, through creating economic value, also can keep the forest standing and benefit people's culture and well-being and local income generation.
Hmm. I think in sustainability, right? If we call what we do as sustainability, a lot of times you're kind of fighting between two things: the economic and the environmental, and you're really always trying to bridge them together. How can we have environmental models that make economic sense, and that can actually benefit everyone? And I think this term of regenerative economies, or in Latin America, as we call it, sociobioeconomy, it's really trying to bridge those together. And it's really asking the question: what if the economy didn't depend on extracting from nature, but instead on protecting it? And one more thing I wanted to ask you, Lisa, is if we look at the Amazon, so we look globally, now if we dive directly into the Amazon, we know the Amazon as, it has immense ecological significance, right? It's seen as a carbon sink. It's got immense biodiversity, the rainfall patterns, and the cultural richness. Could you talk about the Amazon's importance in this regenerative economies kind of conversation too? And then after that, we'll get into Brazil specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Amazon is an incredibly important place to be thinking about socio-bioeconomy. We're seeing, I mean, the Amazon is an incredibly rich, biodiverse carbon store, but we are seeing increasing deforestation in the Amazon, increasing loss of biodiversity in ways that are frankly truly scary. And so it's critical for the Amazon to be transitioning away from these deforestation dependent models toward a socio-bioeconomy. And that's exactly as you said, that really keeps the forest standing, that really doesn't rely on extraction and deforestation in order to create economic growth. And in the Amazon, we see more than 1 million indigenous peoples, many more local communities when you consider quilombolas, river-dwelling communities, other traditional and local communities. And these are the groups of people who are the best protectors of carbon and biodiversity. And they're also the people who are really producing many indigenous and traditional products that are starting to really gain traction on the world stage. So we see things like açaí, like Brazil nuts, really becoming something that people outside of the Amazon are consuming, and there's an increased interest there. And so with that, we see a real critical opportunity to say, how do we support communities in producing these products that are sustainable goods for consumers, and continuing to do it in a way that really manages the forest sustainably. A lot of this is wild harvest, or at the very least, very sustainably managed, and also really generates meaningful income for communities and upholds their traditional ways of lives and their cultural and individual well-being.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like everything kind of comes full circle, right? If you can promote the economy with your local, vegetation, crops, and then be able to sell that on a global scale, that's going to impact the local communities. But trying to figure out a way to do that that's environmentally friendly, I would say it's a challenge. That's definitely something that's not easy. But I think this concept of regenerative economy, socio-bioeconomy, is trying to figure that out. And Juliana, I will kick it over to you for a second, and then really looking at Brazil and Pará State and this whole conversation. But The first thing I'll ask, I mean, we've been talking about regenerative economies kind of on a global scale, but could you define what socio-bioeconomy means in the context for Latin America?
It's an economy based on the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples and traditional communities. It's an economy, indigenous peoples and traditional communities have been developing their own economies and managing the forests and their territories in a very sustainable way. You can see that the example of this is that wherever there is forest today, that's where there are indigenous peoples and traditional communities. So, sociobioeconomy, first of all, is based on this indigenous knowledge system, on the management of species, on the management of the forest, in a way that allows us to use it without degrading it and without causing the effects that we are experiencing today, related both to the loss of biodiversity and to global warming. So, it's an economy based on the sustainable use of the forest, on these forest assets, in a way that maintains all the ecosystem services that the forest provides, in addition to water, biodiversity. So it's an economy that balances all these aspects. We don't stop developing. We do have development, but this development respects the cycles of the forest and all its biodiversity, which is important for us to maintain the planet and life on the planet, which today we see seriously threatened by deforestation and global warming. So, an economy created by indigenous peoples, by traditional communities, and based on this knowledge system of indigenous peoples who have been managing these species for thousands of years, many of the foods we eat today have been cultivated and managed by these populations for millennia, so that today we can have such a rich food system. But they did this sustainably without needing to degrade the ecosystem or exhaust it, without pushing this ecosystem to exhaustion, whether in terms of river pollution, deforestation, or emissions, right? So, it's an economy based on ecology where we use natural resources, but in a sustainable way at a level where the forest, where nature itself can regenerate. The moment this cycle is broken, then we create a huge risk of degradation and start to see the effects we're experiencing today, right? For example, loss of biodiversity and global warming.
So I would ask, when looking in Pot of State, the note that I have down is, really this power of diverse value chains. I have down that there's 40 plus forest-based products in the region, including, to Lisa's point, acai, Brazil nuts, oils, and medicinal plants. Could you speak a little bit on, these specific value chains, and how important they are to not only the local economy, but for the indigenous people themselves that are, in my opinion, are probably maintaining these areas of I guess the value chain.
Let me start by sharing some data. For instance, in the state of Pará, 76% of the state is covered by preserved forests. Of that 76%, one-third is managed by indigenous peoples and traditional communities. These are productive forests, and the TNC study had a primary goal to bring transparency to this forest economy, the economy of indigenous peoples, which is often made invisible by public policies. So, if it isn't visible to public policies, you don't get a range of incentives like credit, financing, or technical assistance to help develop these economies. So, considering that 31% of these forests are being managed by indigenous peoples and 23% by traditional communities, it requires a different perspective on these territories so that we can keep the communities in these areas, but with quality of life. to preserve the forest, but also generate income and quality of life for them. So, TNC focused on studying 30 species from the sociobiodiversity managed by indigenous peoples and traditional communities with the goal of understanding the economic impact of these supply chains on the GDP of the state of Pará. And this study showed that in 2019, these supply chains generated an income of 5.4 billion reais for the state of Pará. So it wasn't a small economy. When we compared it, for example, with cattle ranching, we realized that there was an equivalence in income. The sociobiodiversity economy was generating an income equivalent to that of cattle ranching with a very big difference. This sociobiodiversity economy, this forest economy of the indigenous peoples and traditional communities, provides much greater ecosystem services than cattle ranching because these are economies that have different land use characteristics, right? Cattle ranching clears the forest for pasture and raising cattle, right? But the socio-bioeconomy doesn't do that. It preserves the forest and creates an economy based on that forest. Yeah, both are important to Parás economy, right? But we noticed that even though both have economic importance, the economy based on socio-biodiversity, since it wasn't visible to the government, didn't get as much support as, for example, the cattle industry. So, our main goal was to bring visibility to this economic data and draw the government's attention to this economy so that public policies could reach these territories, allowing us to expand this impact and this economy across all these territories of indigenous peoples and traditional communities in the state of Pará. And we started with the state of Pará because it represents a synthesis of the Amazonian states. What happens in the state of Pará is probably the same reality you'll find in Amazonas, in Acre, in states that have forests. So, the recommendations from our study aren't just valid for Pará. They also apply to other states in the Amazon that have very similar characteristics to those of Pará. So, we ended up with, out of those 30 products, right, we have açaí and arroba and handicrafts. Handicrafts are products made with natural fibers, indigenous paintings, also on fabrics. And if you look at all the indigenous lands, all the traditional communities, they produce handicrafts. But besides handicrafts, they also produce açaí, rubber, biridi, miramuro, and various other species, because one characteristic of the socio-bioeconomy, Preston, is the diversity of products. So it's an economy based on diversity, biological or productive diversity. And this is very positive because this diversity of products and not the monotony of a monoculture is what makes these territories so rich in biodiversity and keeps the forest standing because it gives you different opportunities for products and trade and different economic opportunities. And just to wrap up this part with you, out of the 30 products we analyzed, there are some products that are priorities, right? Those that have the biggest market, the most, the highest sales. And those are açaí, cacao, Brazil nut, heart of palm, rubber, tucuma, cupuaçu, cumaru, niramuru, and Brazil nut oil. These products I just mentioned, just them alone, generated an income of 5.2 billion. This shows the economic market opportunity for all this diversity of products from the Amazon. Because I'm telling you here about 7 products that generated this 5.2 billion in income. But we have 40 products that could gain markets, that need to be introduced to the market, that need, opportunities to develop, to be discovered, even the active ingredients of these products, so that we can, add even more value to these products and bring more income to the communities. So that was our intention. That was TNC's goal, to give visibility to this economy, to show that it exists, it's real, and it's comparable to other economies that currently get more attention from the governments than this one, and that it could be much bigger if there were an effort, a focus on public policies.
Yeah, I would say, Juliana, you make my job easy because I was going to ask about that study in the follow-up question, but thank you so much for breaking that down. I mean, I think now we understand that, a lot of these value chains, they depend on, forest conservation. And if we cut down the forest, it would destroy the economy that sustains them. And in turn, you're going to have a lot of economic effects. So I know in the past conversations we've had with the Nature Conservancy, we've talked about this concept of systems thinking and looking at a problem from all different angles to see how one decision can really have a trickle down effect and impact a lot of different people and economics and the environmental pieces of it. Um, but I would ask, because you mentioned in your breakdown there about public policies, and through public policies you really need financial support and technical support. And I think this concept of rethinking economies, to me, is very complex. Like I imagine looking at the entire economy and Pará state, and then figuring out how can we shift from this traditional way of the economy and shift to this more of socio-bioeconomy. Um, I would ask about, I mean, you talked about it a little bit in your answer, but just the role of the public sector and these public policies. The study that the Nature Conservancy led on the bioeconomy of Pará State's socio-biodiversity, I think is a huge step because, like you said, it made the economics visible to governments. But I'm kind of curious about what happens next. Is it a thing about where you give the governments all the data, you show the information, you show how the economics are, and then it's up to them to kind of make these public policies? I'm just kind of interested in how the process works of actually implementing, or the government implementing policies to rethink these economies.
After TNC published this study, we started supporting the state of Pará in developing a state-level bioeconomy plan. And the state bioeconomy plan for Pará mainly focused on the territories of indigenous peoples and traditional communities on this socio-biodiversity economy. So, the study led to a series of public policies supporting these territories and the development of this socio-bioeconomy in the state. There were investments from the state, right? So this study prompted the government to better coordinate its actions toward a strategic goal, which is to develop Pará's standing forest economy. So they're already showing some results. The state of Pará has already presented some specific gains from the implementation of the first years of this plan. But what we're talking about specifically, Preston, is in relation to public policies. This is included in the Bioeconomy Plan of the state of Pará and, more recently, in the National Socio-Bioeconomy Plan, the federal government's Bioeconomy Plan. First, it's about the relationship, the investments and incentives for these value chains. For example, how to make credit more accessible to these communities. And then Together with Banco da Amazonia, there was a specific line of credit created for these socio-biodiversity products, right? To simplify the bureaucracy around these credit lines so that they could have access and improve their businesses. Technical assistance is another recommendation from the study, and in a way, it's also incorporated as an effort in the Pará study so that technical assistance and innovation can reach these territories. So, the state published some public calls for innovation aimed at these socio-bioeconomy chains, and also the development of financial mechanisms, right, and payment for environmental services. So, also in the state of Pará, they are now developing a state program for payment for environmental services precisely to provide compensation, to improve the compensation for indigenous peoples and traditional communities who take care of this forest. Because they have products, but they're taking care of that forest, and that forest is providing ecosystem services for the whole society. So it's important that they are recognized for this role in management, protection, and conservation, but that they also receive financial recognition. And also there, as a result of the study of the Bioeconomy Plan of the state of Pará, another important initiative from the plan was this, developing this program, right, for payment for environmental services for the indigenous communities in the state. And now, together with the federal government, the government of Pará is going to work on hubs, these are socio-bioeconomy hubs in the state, also very much guided by the study, where we identified which areas of the state have the highest production and, obviously, would need more support. So, in areas with the highest production of socio-bioeconomy and forest products, together with the federal government, socio-bioeconomy hubs will be established. And in these hubs, credit will be facilitated, technical assistance will be provided, and financial mechanisms will be made available so that the ecosystem of community businesses based on the forest can develop. So I believe that the study also played this role, right, of driving public policies in the state. And the first of these, right after the plan, was the creation of the State Bioeconomy Plan, which brings together a set of actions that support the development of this economy, the socio-bioeconomy, this standing forest economy. Right? So, and I think that this economy, we really need a lot of support because it's an economy that obviously really depends a lot on public policies. When I talk about commodities, about other larger economies, they are less dependent on public policies. This group we're talking about, indigenous peoples, traditional communities, those who live in the forest, they are much more dependent on public policies. Yeah, to get, say, a Brazil nut out from deep in the forest, it's expensive. It's not. It's not this logistics. It's costly logistics. And often, if I include that cost in the product, I don't have anyone to sell it to because the nut ends up being more expensive since the logistics are costly. So I need, for example, public policies that support this logistics so I can lower the price of the nut and make it more competitive. If we don't have public policies, the products that come from the forest, from deep in the Amazon, where logistics are more expensive, they just can't compete. So we need public policies. This is a group that needs public policies to develop these economies and make them successful. First, for those living in the territory. Second, for those consuming, right? And for the country's economy.
Yeah, I love that point on how public policy can decrease the price. I would say it would subsidize industry so that something like logistics and the Brazilian nut supply chain would actually be lower, and that product could actually be sold, and the price wouldn't be so high. In my work and day to day, I work in the recycling industry, and we see this through policies like EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility Policy, that's really making, let's say, recycling of different products cheaper, and that way it's more accessible for people to do. But I did want to add, through this series, we have 6 episodes. In episode 1, we spoke with, I'm gonna go back to my notes for a second. We spoke with Paula Caballero and Marcio Stuchman, really on an overview of COP30 and then looking at Brazil as a host country. In that conversation, Paula kind of broke down the Paris Agreement and NDC, so nationally deferred contributions, for when governments sign on, they can contribute to try to get us to not pass these temperature rises by 2050. My mind is kind of spinning right now, and correct me here, but I just think about like a national, not even a national, a global kind of initiative like the Paris Agreement. If there could be something inside that where it would provide funding to indigenous people in a place like Pará State, in a place like the Amazon, because when you look at the importance of the Amazon for the global community, it almost makes too much sense to provide funding from these global initiatives directly to indigenous people. Because for me, I'm sitting here in the United States, but I can understand, how important just for climate change the Amazon rainforest is, in Brazil in particular, because Brazil holds such a high percentage of the Amazon rainforest. So that's kind of just a discussion point. I don't know if there's anything with that, but that's just kind of the idea in my head of, you have these global agreements like the Paris Agreement where money is being funneled. I honestly don't know how that money is being managed and how that money is actually going to different things, but it would seem like providing some of that financing to indigenous communities could really benefit, the globe as a whole.
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. And thinking about financing for Indigenous and traditional communities is really key. They, as we mentioned earlier, they are some of the world's best stewards of carbon and biodiversity, but they receive very minimal shares of financing. We did see at COP26 a $1.7 billion pledge to support Indigenous peoples and local communities, specifically around land rights and forest tenure. So we are certainly seeing increased momentum around directly and more directly funding Indigenous and local communities, but we're still seeing barriers around Indigenous communities being able to directly access that funding. So a lot of time funding flows through intermediaries and can get locked up, taken by overhead costs. And we also see that reporting requirements are often quite onerous. So when money does flow to Indigenous communities, it's difficult for them to sometimes, meet those reporting requirements, even apply for that funding in the first place. So some of the things that we really need to see to be able to unlock more direct funding to Indigenous communities are better conversations between funders and Indigenous communities to really understand what application requirements and what reporting requirements are reasonable versus what becomes really onerous. But absolutely agree that, really unlocking funding to Indigenous and local communities is critical in the fight against climate change, in conserving biodiversity, because it really gives them the resources that they need to continue stewarding their natural resources sustainably. And that can be through territorial stewardship that doesn't involve income generation. It can also be through sociobioeconomy income generating activities. That's another really important role that we see for the private sector, though, as well, is thinking about innovative financial products for Indigenous and locally led sociobioeconomies. So we see that, when we look at basic economies and the way that they've developed, we see that there's, capacity building and business strengthening, access to markets, and access to finance are kind of the 3 key ingredients to what makes any given enterprise be able to succeed. And we see that particularly sustainable enterprises, and particularly those that tend to be led by Indigenous, traditional, and local communities, are disenfranchised from those opportunities. And so how can we really think about more tailored financial services and more direct market partnerships that really allow these communities to scale and grow their enterprises in line with social and environmental impact.
I'll add to what Liza said, right, regarding the COP. Okay, this whole climate discussion. Yeah, the World Bank study showed that we would need, $7 billion annually to protect the Amazon. From 2013 to 2022, $5.81 billion was made available. In other words, the World Bank says we need $7 billion a year to protect the Amazon. And from 2013 to 2022, we raised less than that for all those years combined. Only 3% of that amount goes to nature-based solutions. And less than 1% goes to funding indigenous lands, to the economies of indigenous peoples and traditional communities. If we realize the importance of indigenous lands for climate balance, they are essential for maintaining climate stability and for preventing the world from reaching that point of no return. If we understand that these indigenous lands play a key role in reducing emissions and in lowering global warming in the in the world, then they should also receive greater attention in terms of funding. And today, that's not happening. So when you talk about COP30, about the negotiations, the main topic of discussion at the last COPs has been funding. And for indigenous peoples, it's about direct funding. What they're debating the most and what they're seeking at COP30 is for this climate funding to be increased for the protection and conservation of their territories, but not just increased, because, as I mentioned, today less than 1% of this climate funding has reached indigenous peoples in the Amazon, but also for it to reach them directly. So we really need to create effective mechanisms for these essential resources to reach the local territories directly so that they can truly drive significant conservation results. In fact, at this COP, indigenous peoples are even going to present a proposal for an indigenous NDC precisely to highlight the importance of indigenous lands in maintaining climate balance. What is the contribution of indigenous lands to climate balance? That this contribution should be proportional to climate financing so that they can maintain this conservation. So this is a big discussion, and always, the issue of financing has been a central theme at recent COPs and will continue to be at this COP. But for this topic, we're talking about sociobioeconomy. The main thing is for this financing to be increased and to reach the communities directly, developing mechanisms that actually reach these communities. And as Lisa mentioned, it needs to arrive in a way that's not bogged down by bureaucracy. Because if I create too many barriers, keep requesting, having too many requirements for this funding to reach them, they can't access these funds. We've seen here, we have a good example, which is the Amazon Fund in Brazil. The Amazon Fund is an excellent initiative. It really is. The fund is fabulous. The results it has achieved in recent years are remarkable. But indigenous communities, traditional communities, their associations, their cooperatives, their organizations have a lot of difficulty getting a project approved by the Amazon Fund because of the bureaucracy involved in getting these projects approved. This also applies to credit. This also applies to bank financing. They face the same difficulty in overcoming this bureaucracy. So, how can we, together with the private sector, with philanthropy and with the government. Think of financial mechanisms that are less bureaucratic and more aligned with the reality and needs of these communities, of these indigenous peoples, so that they can manage the forest sustainably and generate income. So they can have a good life, well-being, as they say. Well-being is very much related to, I'm doing well in this forest, I have water, I have food, I have water, but they also want to live well. And living well is also about how they want to have access to the conveniences of the modern world. So they want to have a car, a motorcycle, so that if someone gets sick, they can take them to a hospital. They want to have a cell phone. They want to have a refrigerator, right? So all these innovations of the modern world that, make life easier, that bring comfort. They want those too, right? They want this well-being along with all these conveniences of the modern world as well. So how can we think about financial mechanisms that help achieve this well-being and good living so that we can preserve this forest and keep young people within it? Because if we don't have this economy being developed in a way that brings income and meets the expectations, even those of the indigenous youth in these territories, they probably won't want to stay in the territory, right? And then who takes care of this territory? Who protects this territory? How are we going to ensure rural succession within these territories? So, financing, productive structuring, and income generation are fundamental factors for the protection of these forests, so that these communities can continue living in their territories in a traditional way, preserving their culture, maintaining their indigenous knowledge systems, and managing the land, which is what makes that land, that forest, stay conserved, right? And this will bring benefits to all of us. So, there's no way we can think about climate issues without considering this economy, this income generation, this quality of life for indigenous territories and traditional communities. They really need to be included, right? Directly included in this climate financing.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to kind of end the conversation today. And I think now we all understand, what's coming in COP30 in Brazil. The importance of indigenous communities. How can we provide them direct access to financing, so that not only that they can continue to protect these areas of the forest, but they can live and live as they need to inside these areas. So I would just leave everyone with one of the ideas that we started with, and that's, what if the economy didn't depend on extracting from nature, but instead on protecting it? So thank you both for joining us again. This has been a really fun conversation. And we look forward to COP30 in your neck of the woods, Juliana.